Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. This is a conversation that my friend and colleague Roy and I have been talking about for a while. We just want to have a conversation about what's happening in our country and some of the exciting things that are happening around government of national unity, the challenges that are happening, and just talk to ordinary South Africans. Both of us are practitioners in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so there'll be a lot of flavor of DEI in it, but we're just talking as South Africans. Two South Africans who are diverse in race, gender, and age. He's younger, much older than him, and we want to share a lot around what is happening in our country. So welcome.
Welcome. So my name is Roy Gluckman John. And I always forget that little John at the end because I've now got a double-barreled surname and my partner's like, you must put the John on. So Roy Gluckman John. And I do the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Just in terms of my identity, I identify as a white man, queer, able-bodied. And the work that I do in diversity and inclusion is absolutely a work of calling and of healing. And is incredibly difficult. But here we are.
Yes, and my name is Nene Molefi. I own a company called Nene Molefi. What I do there is pretty much what Roy is doing, work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I identify as a Black Christian woman, heterosexual, able-bodied, a Sowetan by birth. And I'm just happy to be part of people who contribute towards the future of our country.
Nene, I don't think you're doing what I'm doing. I think I'm doing what you're doing. You've been doing this work. I'm doing what you're doing, not you doing what I'm doing. I think being a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner kind of puts us in an interesting space where we're consistently engaging with social issues, behaviors, beliefs, inherited beliefs. So when we were kind of thinking about this podcast, it was like, what if we're holding discussions and dialogues in organizations, what does conversations outside of organizations look like, as it relates to, because I think the work of DEI is about unity. It's about cohesion. It's about how we work well together. So why can't similar principles, or should similar principles be used outside within the national dialogue space?
And especially, Roy, because inside organizations, people have an opportunity to open up, to share their views, to differ with each other. But outside, if you don't work for an organization that pays for your workshop, you actually don't have an opportunity to express yourself. And then people go to X, and then not even everyone has access to that. But those who do have access to that, then they would type up, they will say, and it's different from being in a workshop. Because if I type up a view on X, I just, blah, blah, whatever I'm thinking, it's different from when I'm in a workshop where you can differ with me to say, but Nene, it's not like that. And then I listen to you, and then, that's it. That's how I see a dialogue that would be more useful.
But I also think and when I think about TRC, when I think about national dialogue, actually when I think about Fees Must Fall, I remember so specifically what was lacking in that. And I think the difference between dialogues within organizations and outside is facilitation. And I think that's critical. And I think when I looked at Fees Must Fall and I reflected on it, I was like, that really needed facilitation. And X and other social media platforms doesn't have a facilitator. And I think that's why, for me, this conversation is important as two facilitators. What does that look like?
And because we have facilitated, if we combine both of our experiences, we facilitated so many groups in so many organizations. We see the value. If you have not facilitated before, you might think, as long as you speak, speak. But facilitation is important because we look at things like, no, you have not given someone enough space to express themselves. This one is dominating the discussion. This one seems to, because he or she's got the command of the language, she's speaking more than that. So facilitating these, especially sensitive conversations, is what I think would help in this big national dialogue.
Totally. And I mean, different to moderation, right? It's not like your turn. I think facilitation is then like holding the emotions, right? Because I feel like for me as a facilitator, I like plug into the emotions within the room. And it's like, I sometimes feel it's like holding, I always kind of like the feeling for me is like on a chariot and there's horses pulling in different directions and there's like this hold.
Yes.
And sometimes you can feel one's pulling, and how do you kind of like pull, there's that holding, which is, I think, is different. I think for me, to you, why do you do this work? Why diversity and inclusion? Why facilitate in this work?
I think for me, I've often seen how I show up in these workshops or dialogues is that sometimes, let's say somebody says something that irritates you deeply, something about your own identity as a facilitator. That's most of the time when I'm reminded about why. That's why I'm a facilitator, to say I must actually lead beyond my personal identity. I'm here to help people talk. Even if you can be so triggered in a conversation. But I do this work so that I provide people with the opportunity to express their views, to say, how can we co-create a country that we love together? We want to live in. I want my children, my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, to actually benefit from the legacy of so many leaders that people have done great work. So I'm in this work because I see the value of everyone. I one thing that I observed about South Africa, for example, Government of National Unity, I was reminding someone that, remember, we used to have Government of National Unity. It's not the first time we have GNU.
Yeah.
And one thing about South Africa, I must say, we've always went out to look for unique solutions from ourselves. Because, back in 1994, I think the DA had, just using them as an example, the DA had about 1.73% in terms of what they won, and it translated into 6 or 7 seats in parliament or something. But what I like is the fact that South Africa has also always found a way around diversity of thought, right? Even if you have 1 or 2% at that time, it's like you will be represented in parliament.
Right.
Let us hear your views. So different political parties. So the idea of proportional representation for me talks to the diversity of thought, what we stand for.
Sure, totally.
Let's hear different views. Let's hear what everybody. If you go by the winner takes all, in other countries, they would say, like, if you are 2%, there's no way you'll be represented in parliament. So I love hearing different perspectives. I love hearing people's views because we grow from listening to people, especially when we differ with each other. That's how people grow.
I know that for myself as well as for other practitioners, I always kind of ask young practitioners when they say, I want to do diversity and inclusion work. My question to them is always, what healing are you searching for, right? I think in my experience, people who do this work do it for their own healing, their own something that they need, and that's not in an extractive way and in a way that is shameful. It's like we pooled into this work because there's something about our experience that needs healing and resolution.
Yes.
And I think that's what makes us incredibly powerful and makes this work incredibly powerful, because I've always believed, because I've seen it in myself, that it has the power of healing. I get the why for me of doing this work is intimately linked with my whiteness, my masculinity, and my upper income-ness.
Yes.
I kind of grew up in a home, and like I always think about change as like this very interesting experience of taking really, really long, and then we have an election and we're totally different.
Yeah.
But like it's not. It feels like change happens in an instant, but it actually takes really, really long. But in an instant, we've changed. We're different, and I always feel about like being left behind.
Yes.
And if I look at my parents and how I grew up, like they were left behind, because all of a sudden they grew up in a South Africa very different to me, and then in one election we now one of the most progressive constitution democracies in the world.
So say more about them being left behind.
I don't think they had the space or the interest or the wherewithal to kind of catch up with the ideological shift that had happened. I think they were so indoctrinated, they were so frightened, actually, that all of a sudden we're now in this constitutional democracy, and they're like, but what do I do with those beliefs? Like, what do I do with all the things that I was told? And I think what they did, and I don't blame them for this, I think this was a very natural reaction. And I always kind of think of it in as you can hear, like the holding the chariots, I always think about in like little scenarios. They pulled a blanket over me, and they said, it's scary outside. It's scary. They're out to get us. Whoever that was. Let's hold, let's protect, let's stay in, let's kind of keep you here. And it's frightening outside. And that was so much my experience, you know.
Do you know what's interesting in what you're saying, Roy, that in the same way, if you were to take, I wrote in my book, you know, my book on diversity and inclusion, to say that if you look at, I was talking about my father, who worked for DBS, which was part of Anglo-American, that, you know, his idea of being employed and what he went through, he was a messenger at the time, what he went through, the way he was treated, the way people at his level were treated who happened to be black and all that, is that his idea of leadership, when you are saying they were left behind, even my parents were left behind. Because I remember telling him that he's late now. I remember telling him that that DBS is one of my clients. I was working with the EXCO. He could not believe. He said, "What? Were you there in the 5th floor? And you are talking to those leaders?" I said, "Yes."
Wow.
And he could not believe. Why? Because if you look at the role that he had as a messenger, he was doing photocopies and whatever, and they will just dump things on him, you know, to say, go run here. You know how if we sit with our parents and they tell us that what they used to be called, hey, monkey, why are you doing this? Those things that will make us cringe. And they went through that. Now, I'm saying, think about it. Take your parents and say they were left behind. Take my parents, okay, and say they were also left behind in the sense that, when they look at their own children to say, do you interact like that? With white people, as embarrassing as it sounds, but we need to talk about those people who don't get an opportunity to really interact like that and say, no, that was indoctrination both ways. So our role, those of us who've got an opportunity to work in organizations, our role to say, how do we build the South Africa that we want, taking care of all those emotions. There's a lot of baggage, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of residual hurt and trauma. How do we help people deal with that moving forward?
I mean, I'm so, like, when Government and National Unity was announced, I remember the speech by our president. And in this very eloquent way, he then spoke about the need for national dialogue and like restarting national dialogue. And immediately my kind of ears went up and I'm like, yes, I'm interested. You know, I want to be involved in this experience. I want to be involved in this process. You know, we have the skills. And then I was thinking, what does a national dialogue in 2024 and beyond look like in South Africa? Like, what are we discussing? What is the outcome of that discussion?
Who is in discussion?
Who's in discussion? Who's leading this discussion? And of course, who's facilitating this discussion? And that's kind of, I thought, something that we could talk about. What does a national dialogue look and feel like in South Africa? Where's it happening? And I think what would be interesting is, what are we discussing and what are some of the outcomes? Like, what is it that we are actually trying to do?
And I want to chime in on one of your questions. Where is it happening? For me, it's important because we usually see a lot of dialogue. You switch on different TV channels. A lot of journalists will be, you know, sort of moderating and all that, and that is fine. But often we focus on the same grouping segments of people, right? So where is this dialogue happening? So I'm imagining, like, in the rural areas, like the rural areas where my parents come from in Mafikeng, in whatever the different, in the rural of the rural areas, to say, where are the people who are normally not even considered when we talk about this?
Yeah.
In the places where you even find chiefs under a kraal, where a chief sits with his subjects, with his people. Let us talk about how does national dialogue look like. It has to happen at multiple levels.
Yeah.
All provinces, different levels, not only being confined to those people who are closer to facilities where you can be called to a building, and then you're having a national dialogue. We are denying ourselves of views of people who are, a woman who's selling apples at the corner there who nobody ever talks to. What do you see as a national? Is national dialogue important to you at all? Because they might say,
I'm
that's
tired
not
of talking.
my priority.
Yeah.
You guys have been talking forever. I'm elsewhere. I want better employment,
So then what is the benefit of national dialogue then?
Yeah.
Let's maybe start there. Like why? Why was Cyril?
Yes, we should not assume that when we say national dialogue, everybody's excited. We all know, we want to do that. First of all, what is it?
Yeah.
To what end? What do we want to achieve out of it? Who participates? Where do they participate?
Yes.
And maybe just a kind of an exercise of finding out, just find out from people to say, how some of these influencers will walk around in the street and ask people random,
I love
what is the capital of this country,
Yes,
blah, blah, blah.
yes.
To maybe say to them, what do you understand by national dialogue?
Wow.
How would it look like for you? Is it even important for you?
Wow.
What questions, if you were not to be there physically, what questions would you want answered at that dialogue? That might be something that's worth looking at.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'd love that because all of a sudden we're not seeing national dialogue as a means to an end. There's no end point. Actually, it's one of discovery. Where are we at? What does this nation look and feel like? I love that idea of exploration. Like, is this even something we need? I think it also takes the pressure of trying to create this idea of social cohesion, because I guess what I heard when the president says GNU, national dialogue, I was like, okay, this is about social cohesion, right? This is the fundamental tenet of our constitution. I mean, the NDP, our 2030 plan, it's literally based, the founding conversation is all of the things that happen and we speak about in the NDP can only be achieved if we have social cohesion.
But you and I, because we work in this field, because, this is even the language that we're talking about, social cohesion and all that, immediately we applied a language to it.
Totally.
That when the president says this, it means this. Does it mean that to everybody? What it would we would learn so much from asking just ordinary citizens, the unemployed youth out there in the different townships, in the rural areas, in the cities even, to say, what do you understand by this? And why is it important? Is it important to you? And why is it important?
So do you think then, what I'm hearing you say, do you think that social cohesion is an ideal of the privileged class?
I sometimes think so.
I love that.
I'm telling you, I'll tell you, because
Wow.
if you were to just think of someone who's really going through dire straits out there in the first thing that they will need, they will not say social cohesion.
I need unity.
No, really. I need unity. What for? This is what I need, the basic needs are what's important for me. So I think, because we are in the space of inclusion, we must even include people in defining what this dialogue should be about. Because what do we talk about? What's the agenda of the dialogue? What do we talk about? And, where some people have been saying, we've been talking forever. And we know that talking has led us somewhere, because we have a constitution, the way it was put together. People brought their brains together and there was talking.
Totally.
But not everybody sees the value of talking when you are in extreme poverty. When you have been unemployed for I don't know how long, all you want is, how can you help me get a job?
Like, what do we... I love this. I mean, I think the idea of social cohesion and unity being like the aspiration or the need of the privileged class, I think is really interesting. Maybe I can speak from that class. Because I think that is like my positionality.
Okay too.
When I think about, for me, people around me, or people who look like me who I don't necessarily agree with or identify with, when I hear like the need, so particularly in these sessions we hold diversity and inclusion, their needs emerge. They don't need to say it, but you can hear it. Someone said in a recent session, they said, I love the GNU, a white man. He says, I love the GNU because I finally feel represented. And there is such, in government, and there is such a disconnect in that saying, in that comment, where for the first time this man feels represented in a city, being Cape Town, where he is overrepresented.
I was about to say, Roy, it's like the minute I would immediately say, you are already overrepresented, right? But it's important to listen to his perspective, what he means by that.
Yeah, but I think that's what's hard about a national dialogue is, as the facilitator, it's not jumping into rebuttal. It's saying, let's talk about what you're feeling. And he's really struggled because I kept saying, you're communicating a feeling. What is this feeling, right? Like this idea of being underrepresented. And I think I always talk about this in my sessions. It's kind of like the opening conversation. And it's this idea of voicelessness. And even though we have X and social media, I think that one of the prevailing feelings within South Africa, and maybe definitely privileged class, but probably even underneath is an interesting hierarchical thing, people around, is the sense of voicelessness. I think for white people, for men, for straight people, there's a sense that if we say the wrong thing, we're going to be cancelled. We are going to be seen as racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever it is. And I think also, and I speak about even within organization, right? People of color, women, queer people also feel voiceless. Like if we say anything in critique of leadership, or I'm not having a good time, or I don't feel included, you're the troublemaker, right? So in this like space of voicelessness, national dialogue, I think, gives the promise where I can say what I am feeling. But I think when I think about national dialogue, how do we hold the space for white people to be angry and scared when their fears and their anger may not be fully justified to a person on the other side? Like, how do we hold that? How do we sit with that?
And you know, that's the most, because as you say that, if for a minute I were to step into my blackness, right, that listening to a white male saying, you know, how can I be listened to where my fears are understood and all that? It's like you feel this heat going up to say, what do you mean?
What fears?
What fears? Do you even have an idea of somebody sitting in Mafikeng or somebody sitting in Limpopo, what fears there? And by saying that, you are not invalidating that. That's the complexity of this dialogue. How do you sit with that? How do I sit here and listen if we were to represent our different races and genders? How do I sit here and listen to Roy fully, right? And say that I want to be part of the South Africa, a part of the solution in our country. But I also want you to listen to my perspective so that I give you space to explain. And there's psychological safety for me to challenge you on areas where I say, but have you noticed that your assumptions here require you to hold up the mirror? And then you also give me space to say that without you and I, when we facilitate in the workplace, you find that those who are in the disadvantage, in the minority feel that, I want to say it, but I know when I go back to the office, the boss is going to call me, what did you say in that workshop? So they're also fearful. On the other side, also white people would say, actually, I want to say something, but I don't want to be labeled for the next 8 months that are coming. So herein lies the complexity that how do we create that space that I listen to you, listen to understand, not listen so that I differ with you immediately. You also listen. And then we say, what part of me can I bring forth? What part of you can you bring so we co-create? You know?
And so two things. I think what you said for the idea of co-creation and being part of the solution, that is the sense I get from South Africans, all South Africans, is that we want to muck in, we want to get involved. Like, we want this to be great. We want this to work as a project. So I think that goes without saying, right? I think that we get it. Like, the idea of dialogue is like, how do we get to that point?
Yeah.
You said something though, and I want to maybe ask you to think about something, and maybe it's something that I hold.
Sure.
So you said, how do we listen to understand? And I always discourage people from listening to understand, particularly white people, or actually everyone, because I'm like, you will never understand the experience of coming out to your parents and them rejecting you.
Yeah.
And I can tell you my story, but your understanding, you'll never really understand. And then I'm like, what then can we do in the absence of understanding?
Yeah.
Because I sometimes find that people's need to understand is based on like an unbelieving.
Yeah.
Like, try explain it to me so I can understand. And I'm like, forget about understanding. You're never going to understand. But how do you listen to believe? Like, how do you just say, I'll never understand your experience as a black woman in South Africa, but I believe that this is true.
That's an interesting point, because we often, in our work, we often say, one of the building blocks to psychological safety is listen to understand as opposed to listening to respond. Okay.
Sure.
So it's really emphasizing more the intention that I listen, not that I must come like a ton of bricks immediately and differ with you before I even know what you were saying.
Yes.
Because how do we silence people often is that before I even finish my sentence, you have already understood me from your perspective, and you haven't understood me from what I wanted to say. But I get your point as well, that you will never fully understand my whole life history.
Yeah.
And it doesn't
and your
matter
pain
how
and your
many-
anger and your fear.
and my fear.
Yeah.
But at least your intention is to respectfully listen to me.
Right.
Before you just come with your answers, prematurely.
What do you think is the value of people telling and speaking about their fear and their anger without judgment, without explanation, without rebuttal, without response? Like, what do you think that does to the human being? What do you think that does to us? Because for me, I think that is the space, like, were I to be given the mandate to create spaces for national dialogue, it would be that.
Yeah.
But what is the value of that?
Let me tell you, in fact, just about last week, I was speaking somewhere and I was talking about resilience, right? And I was challenging the statements that we often just, or maybe our parents or leaders just throw in carelessly, like, what doesn't kill you makes you strong, okay? And just be strong. Pain will make you this. This will make you grow. While those statements are true, you need something in between to get to the point of strength.
Of course.
You need something so that thing doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
And what is the something? So I often say, we just throw in that and say, well, it hasn't killed you, so it will make you strong. The reason why I love a book by Gabo Mate, where he says that the body, when the body says no, something like that. And there's also another book that talks about that the body keeps
the score, yeah.
Why what you've said is important, Roy, is that, yes, we have to have space to speak about. I mean, why would organizations say there needs to be psychological safety, and yet at the same time there is no space to speak about my fears? Before you telling me now, be strong, this life is tough, don't be this, don't be that. Then again, it's silence. So I'm agreeing with you, there is space to speak about our fears without checking whether somebody is waiting to say, no, can you just move on, stop talking about that? Because it's almost like when somebody says, what's the saying? That forget the past.
Yeah.
Just forget the past.
Yeah.
Right?
A favorite.
That there is value. There is a lot of value in the fact that it gives you a sense of relief that people have heard your story.
Yeah.
People, you have been able to say, this is my truth. This is my lived experience. It might not be yours, but this is my lived experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that is healing.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense of healing in that. Yeah. This idea of let go of the past. I'll tell you a vulnerable story. I was in university. I was at UCT at the time, and I was a law student. And part of me doing this work is constitutional law and human rights. Like that changed me. It broke me, because I was challenged by equality, human dignity, freedom, social justice. But then my inherited beliefs were there's no opportunities for white men in South Africa. This is apartheid in reverse. So like these two things kind of pulled me, broke me, and like from the breaking, from that pain and the trauma, like comes this, oh, okay, I've been lied to.
Yeah.
Or the truth wasn't as truthful as I thought it was. And then for me it was, what can I do about it? But that had happened, and I was like, felt like this enlightened, woke white South African doing law. And friends and colleagues of mine at the time ran a dialogue at UCT called Black Rights, White Fears, where we would discuss just that. And I was like, I'm going to this dialogue. It's going to be so, it's everything I need. And there were like 200 people in the big Jamison Hall, and it was being facilitated, and people were sharing their stories of their experience of race, from older black men and women to younger black men and women. And it was the last contributor, Wanalisa, who was a black woman my age in my law class. And she was incredibly emotional about her experience as a black woman. And I was like looking at her and I was like, babes, what? You're like in my law class. Like, where are all of these emotions coming from? I was like, no, this is performance. Like, this felt super performative. I was like, no, this is... They said, who wants to, any comments? And I put my hand up, and I'm like, I think what we should do, I think what's really important for South Africa is we all just get over the past and we just work together to build this future, and at the time I thought I was saying this wonderfully cohesive thing, and the room goes really silent, I'm like, wait, what's happened? I don't know what's happened here. I mean, I was young, and it was really through the facilitators, black women, who kind of said, let me tell you why that doesn't work. I mean, that was a turning point for me, So the idea of get over the past, because I've said it and felt it, it feels aspirational. And in many respects, yeah, us all working together would be wonderful. But white people don't fully understand what needs to be gotten over. And I think the work for me at the moment of DEI is around trauma and psychology. That's the work for me, because white people say, oh, but black people can vote. You guys are majority in government. Why are we still talking about this? But you drive nice cars. You guys stay in Bryanston. Why are we talking about this? And I think so kind of going that layer deeper for me is let's talk about how racism, sexism, homophobia erode and damage the collective and individual psyche of individuals, right? It's a psychological thing. And in a sense, so privilege too is a psychological erosion of believing in one's innate humanity,
In addition, yes, it really goes to trauma, right?
Yeah.
But because take that same woman who does law in the same class, and let's say you both are employed in a big law firm.
Yeah.
And remember that you have to show up at work, right? As this black woman, as a lawyer, you have to show up at work. You've got tasks to do, right? You've got clients to look at. You've got, at the same time, you've gone through this trauma. Now we have learned to suppress.
Totally.
You learn to suppress
and
this
that's the
thing
right
that
word, suppression.
Irritates you to the core.
Yeah.
And when it says the body keeps a score, right? And here you are, you're showing up, you're in a boardroom, you're professional, and then somebody says something, it triggers that. You sense a kind of inkling of disrespect, right? That reminds you that, by the way, Nene, you haven't dealt with that thing. You've just suppressed it, right? And then when it comes, sometimes in the boardroom, people would look at you to say, what's wrong? I mean, just calm down.
Why are you so angry?
Calm down. Why are you so riled up?
And
what people don't understand is that over and above me having to compete with Roy, that we have to work and give our best, I also have to deal with these things that have been bubbling. It might not have been Roy in person who did it to me, but systemically, I still feel these things inside of me. So the burden of suppressing things, people forget that suppressing, that you don't deal with something. You just find some hole somewhere for it to and it's like water. Sometimes it just, bloop, it comes out and suddenly people look at you but what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Where's
all of these emotions
you live
coming
where
from?
I live. You live in Houghton. I'm in Houghton. We're in Rosebank. What's the big deal?
Yes.
And you feel, wow, where do I start to explain? Where do I begin?